recording. Okay, so this is part 4 of our discussion of the non-writing prophets, and as I've mentioned several times, the scholars seem to think there were only 4, but I think we've already talked about 10 or 11 of them who were prophets, and some very important, which really surprised me that they are not mentioned by the scholars, that they were non-writing prophets, but they're not. So nothing we can do about that. So let me put there. And so last week, among a million other things we talked about Ahijah, who was the son of Rehoboam, king of Judah. And Ahijah was not a great, faithful king to God, but yet he was more faithful than many. And so, for whatever reason, I presume it was because God sent him to give a message. Judah and Israel were at war, and Abijah went up on the top of this mountain, Zemaraim, and made a speech and pronounced judgment on Jeroboam and for all he had done, and the Israelites, which had split off. This is early after the split. This is Rehoboam's son, and Rehoboam is the king of Israel, the whole nation of Israel, at least temporarily, until he refused to back off of the heavy taxes and the workload that his father Solomon had put on the people. But there's something interesting. Now, one of the things that I don't know if this is going to be good or bad, but every once in a while I'm going to mention something that may not be something we're going to really talk about for 2 or 3 weeks, but there is a scripture coming up, and I don't know if it's today or next week, that talked about Rehoboam not really wanting to do what the young advisors told him, but he was too weak to withstand their pressure. And we'll run across that scripture, and I don't know if it's today or next week or week after next, because that's how far ahead I've gotten so far. God is really stirring me up to do this. So anyway, so Abijah's standing on the mountain, and he's yelling out at Jeroboam and Israel. And in 1 Kings 15:7, it tells us that there was a war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Now, to me, this is interesting because God specifically told Rehoboam, don't gather your warriors and go up and fight against what became known as Israel, the 10 tribes. And yet, almost every king that we're going to read about as we go through this, it says, and there was war between, him and Jeroboam, or him and Jeroboam's son, or whatever. So I plead, I don't understand it, because God said don't do it, and yet here we go. So now we're gonna bounce back and forth.
Since when do we not have a problem with people not doing what God says to do?
I knew somebody was going to say that. Good point, Mark. Very accurate point. That's true. Okay, so we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit between Kings and Chronicles, and then I'll bring in some other scriptures that I think are pertinent to what's going on. But we read this speech in Kings last week, or we didn't read it, but we went through it. But today I want to look at the same speech in Chronicles, because Chronicles gives us some information about what was going on that we don't read in Kings. So this is the same speech. I say speech, same curse, whatever you want to call it, that Abijah gave, but it's by the writers of Chronicles, and they filled in a few blanks. So Abijah is standing on Mount Zemaraim, which is right on the edge, because it says which is in the hill country of Ephraim. So he's right on the border of Ephraim and Benjamin. And he said, "Listen to me, Jeroboam and all Israel." And he pronounces what I consider a curse. And he says, "Don't you know that God gave Israel's rulership over to David and his sons by a covenant of salt? What are you doing putting Jeroboam in the spot of where a son of David should be?" In other words, he's saying it should be me. But yet Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who was Solomon's servant, if you remember some of the early, before Solomon died, Jeroboam was sent on some missions and things. And at one point, Solomon tried to kill him. So what Abijah's saying is that Jeroboam rose up and rebelled against his master. And here's some of the part that the writers of Chronicles put in that we didn't see in, or at least it wasn't phrased this way in Kings. It says, "And worthless men gathered about him." Now, I think all of us probably saw that, even though the King James King's version didn't really say it. But I mean, the writers of Chronicles really come out and say, "No," and worthless men gathered about him, scoundrels. And this is what I was talking about a minute ago, who proved too strong for Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when he was young and timid and could not hold his own against them. And if you remember, Jeroboam and the leaders of the northern tribes came to Rehoboam and said, "Hey, you're going to have to back off. We put up with it from your dad, from Solomon, but we're not putting up with it from you." And the older, wiser advisors of Rehoboam said, "Hey, they're right. You need to back off." And these worthless men, these younger men, scoundrels who proved too strong, said, "No, make it worse." And he said, what was it that my dad punished you with whips, but I'm going to punish you with scorpions, something like that. So Chronicles is what is a covenant of salt? Barb wants to know. Well, it's a covenant. Does anybody know specifically what a covenant of salt is? It's the covenant that God made with Israel. It's a covenant that God made to David, that he would have a son to reign forever. I don't know why it's called a covenant of salt. Anybody got any thoughts on that? Okay, that's all I know. But it was a covenant that God made with David. So Rehoboam could not hold his own against these younger advisors. And so Abijah is speaking of the time when, just after Solomon died, the leaders from the northern tribes came down, but he couldn't withstand the pressure that his friends, the younger leaders, put that word in quotes. So according to the author or authors of Chronicles, they were too strong for him. And he mentions later on that anybody that had a bull and a ram, or a bull and rams, who wanted to be a priest of the pagan gods that were being set up could be. That's all it took. Just anybody, anybody that had rams and bulls could be a priest. And so he goes on and he tells the Israelites that the sacrificial system that God established with the Levites still functions. And he warns them not to fight against Yahweh. He said, now you intend to resist the kingdom of Yahweh through the sons of David. You're not going to listen to the sons of David anymore. You're going to make up your own kings. Being a great multitude and having with you the golden calves which Jeroboam, remember, he set one in the north and one in the south, so that the people of it, what we're now calling Israel, the 10 tribes, didn't have to go down to Jerusalem to worship. Gene says in the second book of Chronicles, God's covenant with, well, I missed that, sorry. Apparently calls it a covenant of salt. So Abijah warns him not to fight against God. He says in verse 9, yeah.
I've got something on the covenant of salt.
Okay.
Salt was required with all the sacrifices. And the question is, why salt? It had apparently may have to do with the preserving qualities of salt, so that it is linked to something that is more in a permanent role. So I was just reading part of an article about that, so it might be something to throw in the mix.
Yeah, that makes sense. That it's salt is you put salt in your food and it'll preserve it. I mean,
So you can relate that to what Jesus said about you are the salt of the earth.
The earth, yeah.
By the way, that what I put up there isn't my own knowledge. I just Googled it, and that's what I found.
Okay. This last line, or last two lines of verse 9, I think are very interesting. And the author says, whoever comes to consecrate himself with a young bull and 7 rams, even he may become a priest, okay? But a priest of what? And Abijah lays it out here. He may become a priest of what are no gods. And I didn't look this up. Mark, can you tell me, does that say Elohim? I'm betting it does. I'll go on. You can bring that in later on if you don't mind. I know there's another spot. Speaking of Ahab.
Which verses? You saying in
verse 9 of 2 Chronicles 13, and it's the last word. He may become a priest of what are no. I'm betting that's Elohim.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And remember, we talked about this several weeks ago. Mark and Michael in particular talked about the unseen realm, and that the word Elohim is used hundreds of times in the Hebrew scriptures, and not all of them have to do with the God family or the Father, however you want to look at the word Elohim. So he may become a priest of what are no Elohim in this case. And then he says,
I would take that as a sense that they are not the true God.
Yeah.
The Elohim think of it as a class rather than a individual being, and but it does refer to an individual being, that is the great creator God. It's a something that a dimension that these beings reside in. We reside in the human dimension. They reside in the unseen dimension. And so those beings might be referred to as Elohim, but not all of those beings are the true God, whose name is Yahweh. So he is a member, Yahweh is a member of that group, but not all in that group are Yahweh.
Yeah.
So, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, these are the little e Elohims. Little g. Notice it's a little g. So yeah, I think you're right that's what he's saying. And in verse 10, Abijah goes on and he says, "But as for us," and this is really stretching it a little bit because they were not perfect. Solomon's wives had talked Solomon into building them groves and idols and all kinds of stuff. So they certainly weren't perfect, but they were better than what was going on in Israel. So Abijah goes on and he says, "But as for us, Yahweh is our God, not those little g, little e Elohims that you all are worshiping. And we've not forsaken him." And we can argue about that, but this is what Abijah's saying. And he says, we've kept the Levitical system in place, and they minister to Yahweh as priests, and the Levites attend to their work the way it was established at Mount Sinai. And he goes on and he says, Rod says the Stone Edition has verse 5 translated everlasting. I'm sorry, I missed that. My chats don't stay up long. Let me see if I can find that chat. Chat. Okay, here we go. The Stone Edition has verse 5 translated as everlasting covenant. Yeah, the covenant of salt, everlasting covenant. And has the note, he took advantage of the years of tranquility to bolster his defenses. He being Rehoboam, or he being, I think it was he being Rehoboam, because Rehoboam did get stronger. We will be reading scriptures about that. Okay, thanks, Rod. Okay, he goes on talking about how we didn't run the Levites off. We're still operating the way God intended. He says every morning and evening they burn to Yahweh burnt sacrifices and incense, and they make the showbread, and they put it in the tabernacle on the clean table and the golden lampstand. He's describing part of the tabernacle, the not the Holy of Holies, but the holy place where the golden lampstand and the table for the showbread and the table for incense was. He says that the golden lampstand's there with its lamps ready to light every evening. For we keep the charge of Yahweh our God, but not you. You have forsaken him. In verse 12, if I can get my clicker to work. Verse 12 says, well, I can't get my clicker to work. There we go. Now behold, Yahweh is with us at our head. He's our leader. And his priests with the trumpets to sound the alarm. They had trumpets that were blown at different times to signal lots of different things. We're not going to get into that. But anyway, he goes on and he says, look, you sons of Israel, don't fight against Yahweh Elohim of your fathers, for guess what? You ain't going to win. So then the chronicler continues explaining how the battle unfolded. So we get a little bit more information about the battle itself from the writers of Chronicles. And we find that Jeroboam was a good general. He knew how to fight a war. He is attacking from both the front and the rear. But guess what he didn't count on? He didn't count on God fighting for Judah. Jeroboam set an ambush to come from the rear so that Israel was in front of Judah and the ambush behind them. You would think, without God involved, Judah's in trouble. But when Judah turned around, guess what? They were being attacked there too. So they cried to Yahweh, and the priests blew the trumpets. And if you remember, many, many times when the trumpets were blown, think of Jericho. When the trumpets were blown on the Sabbath, the seventh time they'd walked around, the walls crumbled. Then the men of Judah raised a war cry, and it was then that God, Yahweh, routed Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. And, that should have been a lesson to everybody. But as Mark said a minute ago, should we be surprised that, the people didn't obey God? So, like in times past, such as Jericho, God fought the battle for him. And he routed Israel before Judah. And in verse 16, he goes on and he says, when Israel fled, God sent the Judah soldiers after them, and Abijah and his people defeated them with great slaughter. And 500,000 men died. This was the big battle. This wasn't some little skirmish. This was two nations fighting against each other. And he goes on in verse 18, he talks about how the sons of Israel were subdued and the sons of Judah conquered them. Why? Because they trusted in Yahweh, the Elohim, capital E, of their fathers. Anyway. And so Abijah pursued Jeroboam and captured from him several cities. And one of them was Bethel. And if you remember, Bethel was right on the border of Ephraim and Benjamin, right on the border between the two nations. So they captured Bethel, where Jeroboam had set up the golden calf and so on. And here's a map. You can see there in the circle. You can see Benjamin, and then you can see above that Ephraim in the big letters, and you can see just inside the upper part of that yellow circle, you can see Bethel, which is where that golden calf had been set up. Now, what are you supposed to do when you find a grove or a temple with the golden calf? Supposed to destroy it, right? Well, guess what? They left it alone. So now Abijah captured this city of Bethel, and it was right on the border where Jeroboam had set up the calf for Israel to worship so they wouldn't return to Judah. See where Jerusalem is? It's the little yellow circle. And see where Bethel is? So what Jeroboam was doing, he was trying to stop the Israelites from going down and worshiping in Jerusalem because he was afraid that they would rebel against him, and then he would be in big trouble. So Abijah recovered Bethel with the towns thereof, it says, so that the golden calf and its chapel and priests fell into his power, but it doesn't seem to have made any difference. it seems that the calf remained undisturbed till the days of the Assyrian invasion. And I didn't get all the history of all of that. Let's just either take my word for it or don't. Says the Lord smote Jeroboam and he died in chapter 13, verse 20. Jeroboam did not again recover the strength in the days of Abijah, and Yahweh struck him and he died. Okay, now here's one of those places where the chronology is kind of tough. I don't think it really makes any difference, but in one place it talks about Abijah dying before Jeroboam, and one place it talks about Jeroboam dying first. You got to remember when the scriptures written, they were written by human beings who were going by their memories, and every single word in the scriptures is not just dictated by God. So every once in a while, we'll find that we have scriptures backwards. Well, one of the reasons why is this: they didn't have correct type. So when they went, oh, wait a minute, I should have said this first, they weren't going to go back and go through all of the papyrus and the papers that they were using and rewrite all of it. So just every once in a while you'll find, particularly chronologically, that it seems to be backwards. So it says that the Yahweh smote Jeroboam and he didn't recover. And after this, Abijah waxed mighty, having 14 wives, 22 sons, and 16 daughters. Now, I'm not sure that I have that in the scriptures, but that's what happened. So Jeroboam died after reigning 21 years in Israel, in the northern tribes. So now we're gonna go down and talk about the southern tribes a little bit.
I just wanted to say that he lost. Adonijah lost 500,000 chosen men. That's a lot. That's as many as the Babylonians bring up against Hezekiah, I think. But it says he never regained his strength. Well, I guess not. It doesn't matter much to us. We're just reading it. It's just, a little bit of text. It must have mattered a lot to them.
Yeah, in verse 17, like what Rod's saying, Abijah and his people defeated Israel with a great slaughter, so that 500,000 chosen men of Israel fell slain. And they fell slain because God was in charge. So thanks, Rod. That's exactly right.
Well, just brought it up, I think, for context. Just give us a little imagination of how great that battle was. Probably we could liken it to the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a huge battle that the Confederacy never recovered from, an incredible loss of life, both sides. But it gives you an idea of how big that was. It was a turning point in the war.
Yeah, that's a good example. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so now we're going to go down and we're going to talk about the southern kingdom for a little while. So Abijam, or Abijah, as the Chronicles writers say it, he died. And they buried him in the city of David, and Asa, his son, reigned in his stead. We come to a good king. Now we had a lot more good kings in the south than we did in the north. I don't think we ever had a good king. Well, there may have been one or two good kings in the north, but Asa was a good king. So the writer relates us and gives us chronologically how this is working. Jeroboam had been the king for 20 years, and it says he reigned in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, reigned Asa over Judah. So Asa had come in a little sooner than what this is actually talking about. And it says Asa ruled for 41 years. And he reigned in Jerusalem. Now, here's something that I have found kind of interesting. Every once in a while, God will have his writers put in something about a mother. And in this case, his mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. And she wasn't a good grandmother or mother. We'll see that in a few minutes. But it says in verse 11, Asa did that which was right in the eyes of Yahweh, as did David his father. Now, we're going to see Asa did that what was right, but he didn't do everything that God wanted him to do. But he did enough that God seemed to be pleased with him. It says he took away the Sodomites out of the land. If you remember, there were male prostitutes. He took away the Sodomites out of the land and removed all the idols that his fathers had made. Now, his fathers are Abijah and Rehoboam and Solomon. David didn't make any idols. So we've got 3 generations of kings of the southern tribes who were setting up idols because that's what their wives wanted. Yeah, I'm sorry, ladies. I'm not talking about you all. I'm just reading the scriptures. But he took away the Sodomites out of the land and removed the idols that his fathers had made. And Maacah, his mother, even her, he removed from being queen. Now she was the queen. She was his mother. So I think they call her the queen mother. Why? Well, because she made an idol in a grove. And Asa destroyed her idol and burned it by the brook Kidron. He was doing what God told him to do. And other kings were told the same thing, but guess what? They didn't do it. But the high places were not removed. Didn't do it all. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was perfect with Yahweh all his days. And he brought in the things which his father had dedicated and the things which he himself had dedicated into the house of Yahweh, silver and gold and vessels. And if you remember those golden shields and so on. But verse 16, even though Judah had routed Israel, there were still battles. There was war between Asa and Baasha. Now, where'd Baasha come from? We hadn't been told anything about this guy yet. Here we go back to the north. And the days which Jeroboam reigned were 22 years, and he slept with his father, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his stead. Now, this is when we have a series of kings in the north that don't last very long. Nadab, the king of Israel, the northern tribes, reigned for 1 year. It says, now Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah. See, it's keeping us up with what's going on in the south, along with what's going on in the north. It says he reigned over Israel for 2 years. And guess what? Shock, shock. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, in the sight of Yahweh, and he walked in the way of his father and in his son, which he made Israel sin. And if you remember going back to Jeroboam, that's the big sin of Jeroboam and his descendants, that he sinned and made Israel to sin. And this is something David never did. David sinned, but he never allowed Israel. At that time, it was the combined nation. He never allowed Israel to set up the idols and so on. Solomon did, but not David. So anyway, here we are. Nadab is an evil king. Then Baasha, the son of Ahijah, and this is not Ahijah the priest, I mean the prophet. This is Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against him. Conspired against who? Conspired against Nadab. And he struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel were laying siege. So, his attention, Nadab's attention was the war. And so Baasha snuck up, or had him snuck up, or whatever. Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned in his place. And then the rest of the acts of Nadab and all he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? There are a lot of books that are mentioned in the scriptures that were, for whatever reason, were not put in the Bible as we have it. But there were these books, these history books. Now, let's look at it that way. This was a history book of the kings of Israel. Now, 1525. All right, here's some information that I got out of Expositor's Bible Commentary. I like expositories. It says, meanwhile, in the northern kingdom, Jeroboam had died and was succeeded by Nadab, his son. But Nadab only reigned 2 years before he was assassinated by Baasha. And I'm not 100% sure that Baasha was not the son of Nadab, but we'll either see or not see that later on. Baasha's ascension year was the 3rd year of Asa's reign. So we got a good king reigning in the southern tribes and a sorry king reigning in the north. And so moving swiftly into Judah, Baasha seized the city called Ramah, which was only 4 miles north of Jerusalem. And it stopped further drawing away of Baasha's subjects, but it cut off the main road out of Jerusalem, shutting down all communications between Judah and Israel. And this gave Baasha control of the trade routes. And that was very important. Very, very important. And in verse 27, okay, wait a minute. All right, let me read a couple of scriptures that I, for some reason, didn't get in this thing. It says, then Baasha, the son of Ahijah, conspired against him. I've already read that. Baasha killed him. And Okay, so now I want to go back to something we covered in one of our earlier studies. You remember back in 1 Kings 14 when Jeroboam's son was ill, and Jeroboam sent his wife to the prophet Ahijah to trick him and find out if the child would live. And God warned Ahijah that the wife of Jeroboam was on her way. And so Ahijah the prophet spoke a prophecy to the wife of Jeroboam, and this was around 912 BC. I think everybody will probably remember this. She walked in and he says, well, good morning, wife of Jeroboam. And so she knew she was found out right at that point. And then he tells her why she was there and tells her that her son is going to die the second your foot hits Israelite soil. So in 1 Kings 14, this is what it says. Now Yahweh had told Ahijah, Jeroboam's wife's coming down to ask about her son because he's sick. And here's what I want you to say. I want you to tell her that I being Yahweh, I am bringing calamity on the house of Jeroboam. I'm going to cut off from Jeroboam every male person bond and free in Israel. And I'm going to make a clean sweep of the house of Jeroboam as one sweeps away dung till it's all gone. Verse 11, I mean, you talk about a tough prophecy. What he's telling her, anybody who belongs to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. And he who dies in the field, the birds of the heaven will eat, for Yahweh has spoken it. And what he's saying here is they're not going to have peaceful burials, except for this son that's sick. And he says, it came to pass when he reigned, and this would be, just a minute, is this Asa? Yeah, I think it is Asa. Sorry about that. It came to pass when he reigned that he did it. He fulfilled his prophecy. He smote all the house of Jeroboam. He left not to Jeroboam any that breathed until he had destroyed him, according to the saying of Yahweh, which he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. Why? Because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned. Remember in our first or second session, I gave you all the different scriptures. I think it's 14 different times that the scriptures talk about the sins of Jeroboam, who sinned and made Israel to sin. Well, this is why Jeroboam's family is being destroyed. Because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he had sinned, and which he made Israel sin, by his provocation wherewith he provoked the Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger. Hey, I don't want any prophet or anybody else to tell me that I have provoked God to anger. That's not a good thing. It is not a good thing. So now, Abijah and Jeroboam are both dead. Jeroboam's entire family is dead. And I based on my resource, I mean, my reading, Abijah and Jeroboam died within about a year of each other. I'm making, it's not important, but it's just something. So Asa is now ruling in Judah, and he's a good king. But Nadab is ruling in Israel, and he's a bad king. But Nadab only reigned a year and was murdered by Baasha, who may have been his son. Now, the timeline I'm using says that Baasha reigned from 909 to 886, and it's about the same time that Asa reigned, from 911 to 870. They're reigning a whole bunch of years, 17 or 18 years at the same time. Now, another thing we read last week, I think it was last week, in 2 Chronicles 15:8, God gave Asa a warning. Now, when Asa heard these words and the prophecy with which Azariah, the son of Oded the prophet, spoke. Okay, so we have another prophet now. We have a prophet named Azariah who came to Asa and said, Asa, you got to get these idols out of Judah and Benjamin, from the cities that we captured, during the war in the country of Ephraim. And then he restored the altar of Yahweh, which was in front of the porch of Yahweh. And that this seems to me to be talking about the tabernacle, the altar which was in front of the porch of Yahweh. Okay, let's see here. Where's my notes? It says, now there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. And Baasha went up against Judah and captured one of the cities, Ramah. in order to prevent anybody from going in or coming out to Asa, the king of Judah, which I read a minute ago about the trade routes were stopped. And then in verse 18, Asa took the silver and the gold from the house of the Lord and treasuries of the king's house and delivered them into the hands of his servants. Why? Because he needed some help. And so he sent them to Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram from Damascus. And he said, look, let's have a treaty. I need you to help me. And I've given you all of this silver and all of this gold. And I'm asking you to break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so that he'll withdraw from me. And in verse 20, it says that he did it. Ben-Hadad listened to Asa, and he sent his commanders and so on. And it scared Baasha, verse 21. When he heard of it, he ceased fortifying Ramah and remained in Tirzah. And then Asa made a proclamation to Judah and said, they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timbers, which Baasha had built, and King Asa built with them Geba of Benjamin and Mitzpah. And I'm sorry, these are not major things, and hopefully it doesn't confuse you. But now Asa's about to die. He reigned 41 years, and he was a good king, and he tore down a lot of the groves. Now, all the acts of Asa and his might and all that he did in the cities he built, are they not written in this history book? But in the time of his old age, he was diseased in his feet. We don't know why in the world the writers of Kings put that in there. It was apparently important to them. Whatever it was, he died. He slept with his fathers and was buried with his father in the city of David. And another good king reigns. This is a rare thing, 2 in a row. And we're all familiar somewhat with Jehoshaphat. And now it's about 890 BC. It's about 900 years before Christ was born. And the prophecy comes to pass at the hand of Baasha, grandson of Jeroboam, who had murdered his own father, Nadab. Baasha, the king of Israel, murders Nadab after 1 year, and he reigned 23 years. And he killed him in the 3rd year of Asa. Now, we go on. In the 3rd year of Asa, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, became king, and he reigned for 24 years. And they're reigning about the same time. I think 17 or 18 years, as I said. But guess what? The king of the north. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? We're not getting into that prophecy. The king of the north did evil in the sight of Yahweh and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. Now I want you to think about something. You know, we've heard about Maacah, however you pronounce her name, who was a wicked mother, who raised her son to be wicked. And his father was wicked. And so, how do you get out of that? If the mother and the father of all of these kings of Israel are wicked and walk in the way of Jeroboam, how in the world do they ever escape? On the other hand, the kings of the south had good parents. See, we had Asa and his wife, we assume, were good parents and taught Asa to be a good king, to be a good boy, to be a good man, and to be a good king. And so you don't read about Asa being a bad king. Now we're coming across a new prophet here, Jehu, the son of Hananiah, and he came against Baasha, and he told Baasha, he said, "Look, guess what?" And this is coming from God. "Inasmuch as I exalted you from the dust and made you leader over my people Israel," and guess what? You walked in the way of Jeroboam, and you made my people Israel to sin and provoked me to anger with their sins. Now, going back to David, God would tolerate individual sins. God tolerated the sins of David and forgave him for those sins. Solomon had his own personal sins, but he brought in the religion of his wives. So this is what provokes God. You can, we all have our own personal sins and we can be forgiven for them. But if we're the leader of his nation, we don't want to lead the people or allow the people to worship pagan gods. So anyway, he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to consume Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam. What did he do to Jeroboam? He wiped out the whole group of them. A descendant of Jeroboam didn't go past that date. And he's going to do the same thing to Baasha and his family. Anyone of Baasha who dies in the cities, the dogs will eat. And anybody, any of his who dies in the field, the birds of heaven will eat. The same curse, if you will, that he put on Jeroboam. He said, they're not going to have peaceful burials. They're not going to have pomp and circumstance. They're going to lay out in the field and they're going to rot. And the dogs will eat them and the birds will eat them. Verse 5. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did go in this history book again of the kings of Israel. And Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah, and his son Elah became king in his place.
Say, Skip.
Yeah, Mark.
I think it's good, since in the last couple of verses we've read a reference to the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, and now in verse 5 here, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, since we're not familiar with these books, it's proper to understand that this is not talking about the books that we call the First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. Those are not the same books as is mentioned here.
Right.
So the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, to my knowledge, it does not exist. Neither does this book, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. So there were other writings that were around, and we find some of those things referenced here. Just a point.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think in the case of these two books, these were history books that were written about the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, and they never made the canon. They probably didn't exist. They were probably destroyed.
Yeah, they're history. They're just listings or whatever, some kind of history. Yeah. In fact, the books that in the Bible that we call Chronicles were written much, much later than this. In any case, I think that they may have been written at the times of the Babylonian captivity. And technically speaking, I think the canon of the Old Testament or canon of the scriptures they don't include those books. They're part of the writings section, I think.
The the two books of Chronicles that
Yes,
are in the scriptures are part of the writings.
I think they are part of the writings.
Okay.
I didn't look that up, but I think that that's right.
Okay. All right. That would be along with Psalms and Proverbs and so on. And maybe Daniel. I think, didn't you mention that Daniel is sometimes considered one of the writings?
Yeah, I think that that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And for those, I think everybody probably knows this, but you had the Torah, the law, and then you had the writings, which were, Chronicles and Psalms and Proverbs and so on. And then you had the prophets, which we're going through now. I'm not sure we will ever get through them, but I'm enjoying it. I hope you all are. And when you talk about the law, the prophets, and the writings, you're basically talking about the whole what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, so Baasha is now dead, and Elah has become the king. Now, I think it's interesting that, and I don't know why, and I think this is one of those cases where the author or authors of Kings wrote something down and then went, oh, I need to go back, but I'm not going to rewrite the whole book. Because in verse 7, it says the same thing. Moreover, the word of Yahweh through the prophet Jehu, the son of Hananiah, came against Baasha and his household, both because of all the evil which he did in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger with the work of his hands in being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he struck it. Because that's the same thing it says back here. But anyway, it's there. Now, I want to interject something here. I guess I interject lots of things, but I want to interject something that I find kind of interesting, and I'm sure most of you, maybe all of you, have already seen this. But I want to jump ahead from about 886 or 890, where we are right now, to 740 BC and talk about some things that happened in that, about the reigns of some of these kings of Judah and Israel. And we'll get to them later on, although we've already talked about some of them a little bit. But Elah, the one right here that's just fixing to reign, he only reigned 1 year. Zimri reigned 7 days. He didn't even have time for his name tag to be made. Azahiah reigned 1 year. Now, these are all northern kings. Shallum reigned 1 whole month. Zechariah, and that's not the prophet, Zechariah, the king of Israel, reigned 6 months. And Pekahiah, or however you pronounce his name, reigned for 2 years. So being a king of Israel wasn't a real safe job to have. They didn't last long. But Judah wasn't totally immune to short reigns. It wasn't nearly as bad as what happened in Israel, but Azahiah reigned for 1 year. Ammon reigned for 2 years. Jehoahaz reigned for 1 year. And Jehoiachin reigned for 1 year. These guys didn't last long. There was a lot of stuff going on. There were assassinations. There were wars where a king was killed, and so on. I don't know if we have any resignations during that period, but anyway, I thought that was interesting. Matter of fact, I may have it. Yes, I do. Sorry, I should have done this. Give you a visual.
What about impeachments, Skip? No impeachments?
Jill, I'm not 100% sure, and one of the reasons is we haven't come to those scriptures yet. So I just kind of looked up, so, and they may have been removed. You're exactly right. I bet some of them were, and we'll read about all of these guys, as we continue to go through this. Shalom there, and Zechariah and Pekai, whoever you pronounce that, and then the kings in Israel, which did last. They all lasted a little longer. Now there was one, and I think, Jill, I think I may have it in here, where as soon as, I think it's coming up next. So let me just go on. All right, so Baasha died and slept with his father and was buried in Tirzah, and Elah his son reigned in his stead. So now we get a date. We now know when it was. It was in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, when Elah, the son of Baasha, began to reign over Israel in Tirzah, and he reigned for 2 years. And his servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, and he got drunk, and Zimri went in and killed him. And that was in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. And Zimri reigned in his stead. And so the prophecy of Jehu against Baasha comes to pass. It came to pass when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he slew all the house of Baasha, just like he had been told. He left not one that pisses against the wall. That's a way it's talking about males. Neither of his kinfolks, and I love this, his friends didn't even survive. I mean, this guy, Zimri, didn't want anybody connected with Baasha to be around to give him trouble. And in verse 12, thus did Zimri destroy all the house of Baasha according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke, by the words of Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, by which they sinned, and they made Israel to sin in provoking Yahweh Elohim of Israel to anger with their vanities. Both of them angered God. And then here we have this history book again that Mark was talking about. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Not First and Second Chronicles that we read about. This is a history book. Now, Zimri's the one that didn't have time to get his name tag printed. He lasted 7 days. In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned for 7 days. And the people were encamped against, they were, in an area that belonged to the Philistines. And they heard the saying, Zimri has conspired and has slain the king. Wherefore all Israel made Omri, the captain of the host, king over Israel that day in the camp. And Omri went up, and they besieged Tirzah. And so when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the palace of the kings and burnt the king's house over him, and he died. He committed suicide. For his sins which he sinned in doing, and the same thing, the sins of Jeroboam, he walked in the way of Jeroboam, and he made Israel to sin. And we get another mention of this history book. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri and his treason, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Now, when Zimri's killed, there's a fight over who is going to be the king of Israel. The people were divided. Half the people followed Tibni, and half followed Omri. But the Omriites defeated the Tibniites. The people that followed Omri prevailed against the people that followed Tibni, the son of Gineth. And so Tibni died and Omri reigned. And again, they tell us when this is going on. In the 31st year of Asa, the good king of Judah, began Omri to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 12 and a half years. And you're going to be really surprised at this next scripture about Omri. But Omri wrought evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Isn't it a shock that a king from the north wrought evil in the eyes of God? But here's something we're going to see a few more times. Omri did worse than all that were before him. All that were before him. Now I got to pull something out here to read this. That would be Elah, Baasha, Nadab, and Jeroboam. I don't know how many. I haven't added up the number of years. Let's see. It goes from 931 to 874. So that's 20 minutes. It's about 50 years. Omri wrought evil in the eyes of Yahweh and did worse than all that were before him. Why? Because he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sin, wherewith he made Israel to sin. And that's a sin that God will not tolerate. To provoke the Yahweh Elohim of Israel to anger with their vanities, their pride. And then here's this book again. Now the rest of the acts of Omri, which he did, and his might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, this history book that we don't have a copy of? So Omri died and was buried in Samaria, and guess who? Ahab, his son, reigned in his stead. Omri's son, Ahab, has puts them all to shame. His name is Ahab, and he reigns for 21 years. And he will have to deal with the greatest of the non-writing prophets, Elijah. But we'll hold off talking about them till next time. This was a little shorter today, but that's okay. We got plenty of time to talk. So we've gone through a bunch of kings. We've bounced back and forth between the north and the south. And the kings of the north were all scoundrels. And they led the nation of Israel to sin. But most of the kings of the southern tribes, Judah, reigned and basically followed God. Now they had some issues and problems, and they didn't tear down all the groves and all the idols, but they tore down some of them. And one of them removed his mother from being the queen mother because she had built a grove and put up an idol. So anyway, comments?
Well, I guess just for a sake of discussion, I'm curious what Jill was asking in terms of impeachment. Because it seems to me that, just killing a king and removing him was how impeachments were dealt with back in those days.
Well, I was really just kidding. It was just that Skip was listing all the different ways the kings got removed from office, and I just wondered, had they not thought about, had they obviously hadn't come up with the concept of impeachment at that point in time. So,
Right.
so yeah, it was really just.
Oh, it's facetious. Okay. Yes, I think just as you brought it out, I think impeachment is a construct having to do with once they got out of the blood right of kings, when we got into people being able to elect their rulers, I think that's where the concept came from. Out of, I don't know if it's Blackstone or wherever, the whole concept of impeachment had to do with, the people choosing a king versus the blood nobility choosing a king.
Yeah, one of the things that I haven't checked out thoroughly is, were all of these guys the sons of the previous king? I think the answer to that is yes, until we get down to Zimri. And I don't think Zimri was the son of Omri. We started.
Right. Yeah, he got drunk and killed him, I think, right?
Yeah.
He got drunk and killed, was his servant. But then it wasn't Zimri's son that took the throne. So you're still following a lineage of whoever takes the throne. It's a blood lineage type of thing, as opposed to the people choosing the king.
Yeah, from then on. It's interesting how some of these kings were able to hold their position. Now, the kings of the south were all descendants of David. Yeah, I say all now. Let's put that word in quotes. The vast majority, I think they were all descendants of David. But in the north, they were certainly not descendants of David. But I'm not sure that they were descendants of Jeroboam all the way down. I don't think they were.
The the kings of Judah were essentially the lineage and of the kingship that God established. They weren't perfect individuals for sure. Who weren't, they all had problems. But I think the point in the scripture is that this is the lineage that eventually produced the Messiah, Jesus. He came from that lineage, which, God was working out something. Now, the Israelite, the northern tribes, commonly called the House of Israel, it was a free-for-all. And there is no lasting lineage from family to family. You might go a couple of generations and then somebody gets killed and the new person takes over.
Yeah, in looking at this chronology of the kings, mine stops at Jehoiachin in basically 600 BC. I'm gonna have to check on that and see.
Well, that would be correct. The kings, the kings acting as kings stopped, but that the family lineage continued on. There was no king after Jehoiachin. They were taken into captivity, and the whole kingship of Judah terminated.
Yeah, and we know the kings of Judah when Jesus Christ was living were certainly not descendants of David. It was a political position, wasn't it? That was.
Yes, very much so. It was a political thing that began to be controlled by the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans.
Well, I'd like to talk about the struggle for power. Whenever you get into politics and so forth, and you have no boundaries, morally speaking, which when you're going about slaughtering each other, that's exactly what you've got. You're always going to fail. And rather than stand back and let God do his purpose as he sees and reward you or not, when you engage in a struggle for power, as we've seen so many people here, they end up slaughtering each other. And they go back to really being very low-graded individuals when it comes to morality and decency. So abandoning God and abandoning humility just creates disaster.
Yeah, and the big problem was allowing the nation to worship the groves and so on. Israel, when they came across the Jordan River, immediately started disobeying God and not destroying the nations that they were coming up against over there. And this continued after they were established as a kingdom with real kings. You started with Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, and then Rehoboam, and there was a split. But anyway, I don't know where I was going. This is part 5 that I'm showing here. I don't know if y'all can see it. This is when we're. I've got here the worst of the worst is beginning to reign in the north, Ahab, but he'll be dealing with the best of the best, Elijah. And so it's taken us 4 weeks to get to Elijah. So all right. Any other comment? It's funny. I've always gone by words, and it used to be that about 2,200 words or so was an hour Bible study. Of course, we've been going an hour and a half, I guess. I had 3,600 words in today's session, and next week we'll have 4,500 words, about 1,000 words more than today. Not that makes any difference. I just don't know really where to cut off. So anyway, I'm going to stop recording. Right.
I think it's a good idea just to go for a while and see where we go.